Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on processes to manage medicine supply disruptions. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions via Slido at www.slido.com using the event code #medicinesupply. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Please note that we will not be accepting questions via the GoToWebinar chat function. It is now my pleasure to introduce your first speaker, Julian Beach, Interim Executive Director of Healthcare Quality and Access Group, MHRA.
Good morning, and thank you very much for everybody's attendance. We have a webinar this morning which is looking to understand how the ecosystem works together to manage these processes for supply disruption. I'm really pleased to welcome colleagues from the NHSE and also from Department of Health so that we can then answer questions around the regulatory side of the medicine supply process so that it demystifies, enables people to ask those questions. At the end of it, in those questions, we will be, as I say, we will be doing a Q&A session. With that Q&A session, we will only be focusing on the processes and how we operate. We won't be taking questions on individual applications or any individual products. We will also not be taking any questions on anything else other than the supply disruption or how we manage supply and escalations and things like that as we go through. So with that, if we go on to the next slide. So really pleased to say the agenda that we have this morning is with Kate Mitchell from DHSC, Zahir Rashid from NHSE. Also then we have from MHRA colleagues Bernadette Sinclair Jenkins and Rachel Bricoli, and then with a section on how industry can help us, and then we'll go into a question and answer session. So I hope that gives a very clear overview of what we're doing this morning. And with that, I would like to hand over to Kate at DHSE to start the process this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Julian. My name is Kate Mitchell. I'm one of the principal pharmacists in the medicine supply team here at the Department of Health and Social Care. I will be co-presenting with Zahir Rashid, who is a Senior Medicines Assurance Manager and Supply Chain Resilience Lead at NHS England. Next slide, please. I think that, yeah, doing that, thank you. So I guess the first thing to say is everything we do is very, very collaborative. We work in a cross-functional collaborative ecosystem, and we can't do anything without the support of others. So I work very, very closely with colleagues in NHS England. As you'll hear throughout today, we work very, very closely with the MHRA to mitigate, also to prevent a lot of medicine supply issues. Obviously, we work really closely with some of yourselves from pharma industry, and we have a network of people that we call on to support us when there are issues, to make sure that we are doing as much as we can to prevent any impact to patients. Next slide. I thought it would be really useful for you to understand the roles of myself and Zahir's team over at NHS England and how we interact, because I think sometimes that can be a bit confusing. So overall, we sort of manage the day-to-day issues across both primary and secondary care in my team. Zahir's team, the Medicines Pharmacy Supply Chain team in NHS England, are predominantly focused on issues with secondary care products that are on NHS framework agreements. But the main point here is to say that we do overlap, we do work very closely together, and we do collaborate on most issues that we come across. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, this is what we do. And in a minute, Zahir's going to take you through each of these 3 sections in a bit more detail. So once we are notified of an issue, and that can happen via a variety of routes, our main route is via our discontinuation and shortages portal, which hopefully a lot of you are familiar with, and Zahir's team are predominantly notified by their supplier issues spreadsheet, but there is a whole list of other well-known escalation routes by which people let us know about supply issues. Once we're notified, we will then risk assess the issue, taking into account a whole host of data and information, and using our own knowledge to understand the impact that we think that issue will have. And then based on that risk assessment, we will then look at what management options we can employ to prevent and mitigate that issue. And we take each issue individually and we assess it on its own merits before we look to decide which management options we would use for those. Next slide. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Zahir. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, so just to note, I'm Zahir Rashid. I'm the Medicine Resilience and the Supply Chain Lead for NHS England's Medicines Value and Access Department. Work hand in hand with Kate. So I'm going to run through this process of managing and mitigating issues. So firstly, notification, as Kate has said. So as a part of the Regs 2019, there is a mandate for our supply base to let Kate and the team know via the Dash portal if they are going to be out of stock of any product or if they are planning to discontinue any products. And there is a time frame involved. That is a 6-month period. So we are expecting early notification of out of stocks or discontinuations. Primarily for Kate's team, that comes via the Dash portal. For the NHS England framework items, we do have a contractual process whereby we ask each supplier on a framework to report in any discontinuations or termination of contract, as well as any shortages on a fortnightly basis. So that is a manual process whereby every line that is contracted to supply is sent with a return request for information that has to be delivered into my team once a fortnight. Okay, I'll run through the next slide, please. Okay, what do we do once we're notified? So as you can imagine, we have to risk assess. What does this shortage mean for us and for our patients? Obviously, we need to find out the nature of the problem. We're here on a joint call with MHRA. Is it a regulatory issue? Is there an access to API or a change in practice or some sort of failure in the QMS? We really do need to have that information to support the risk assessment and then the ongoing mitigation. Obviously, we need to know how long it's going to last. Something that will be out of stock for a week, when the stock in wholesalers is multiple weeks, is going to have minimal impact, whereas something that's going to be discontinued or it's going to be a very long out of stock where there's not very many other products with market authorizations available is going to be more complex and more difficult to manage. Obviously, we need to understand the indications of this medicine, how it's used, and that being licensed, as well as those off-label and unlicensed. Obviously, my specialism is secondary care. We do use medicines outside of the licensed indication in certain instances, in niche areas, pediatrics specifically. We do need to know where it's being used. Obviously, how much that supplier has in regards to its market share. And then we go on to look at what alternative products are available. Depending on the risk assessment, we will then deem it to a specific tier and escalate the process. So next slide, please. Okay, so management options. So as you can see, there is multiple facets to this. There's multiple stakeholders and we have to engage predominantly all of them to make sure that we have a holistic approach to how to manage the issue. So we work with manufacturers, obviously alternate manufacturers to see if there's alternative products available. We work with the wholesalers to see how much stock actually remains within the system. If it's a short-term issue, we can often mitigate that by stock already in the supply chain. We work extensively with our colleagues at the agency for regulatory support, for advice, for access to alternative products, and for specialist advice. So we'll talk about the MSRG in a moment, but the agency are integral in the way that we manage shortages, so we couldn't do it without them. We work with our colleagues in the specialist pharmacy service, so we have specialists that give us advice in regards to medicine's use, medicine safety, as well as the medicines, the QA and the QC groups within SPS. We issue things like serious shortage protocols, which the department issue, which allow community pharmacies to interchange products safely and effectively. We work with our regional procurement specialists in secondary care. So I'm sure you've come across these colleagues before, but they are our delegated authorities within the regions to support procurement for regions within England. They've got a direct link into the hospitals and the local procurement teams and help us to ascertain the nature of the issue, as well as if there's any intricate management required in regards to allocations, distribution, and local cascades of information out into the system. Obviously, we'll use licensed products as a primary example, an ideal swap. If we can't have access to licensed products, we may invoke the use of off-label or unlicensed medicines. The department support in regards to overall governance, the agency support in regards to allowing us access to unlicensed medicines. So Francisco on the call leads that team and supports us in regards to the ability for us to access products that aren't available in the UK for very specific instances and for very defined durations of time. Once we have these management options, we use the MSRG to escalate and to prepare the mitigation plans. So next slide, please. Okay, so the MSRG, our Medicine Shortage Response Group, is a clinically chaired decision-making body, and it oversees all of the work that we do across the department as well as NHS England. It spans from the initial understanding of notification all the way up to management options. It is chaired by Justine Scanlon, head of the SPS, and has got representation from the agency, the department, multiple facets of NHS England, whether it be our team within procurement or the clinical directors and the patient safety leads. A key role of the MSRG is to determine and oversee the escalation and de-escalation of issues. So it gives us that umbrella, that clinical support to make sure that what we're doing is in the best interest of our patients. It agrees the content and dissemination routes of the communications, and it provides sign-off for our management plans. And like I said, the representatives include patient safety, primary care, regional procurement specialists, the H&J, communication teams, SPS, as well as input from the devolved administrations, and then all parts of the agency, whether it be from the DMRC or licensing or unlicensed medicines. We have really do have a multi-stakeholder group across the board giving support to managing shortages. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we've mentioned about clinical criticality. So we tier the issue depending upon how we deem it to affect the patient at hand. So we have tier 1 to 4, 1 being the lowest impact issue, and this tiering is primarily about patient risk and harm. So a low tier 1 is likely to carry low risk. Management options will result primarily in patients being offered the same licensed medication in replace of another licensed medication. So, in instance, maybe one generic for another. The communication routes will vary depending on the criticality. So as you can see from the table, a tier 1 issue will normally just have an entry onto the SPS tool and an entry onto my fortnightly information cascade out to the supply base. A tier 2 is more complex. It requires more intense management and has a greater risk, potential greater risk when the mitigation options need to be implemented. So you can see the communication cascades here are the first two, as well as potentially a SSP and a medicine shortage notification, so an MSN, which is our primary route of disseminating information out as a tier 2. Tier 3 is even more critical and has the potential safety implications to harm potentially, and it may require clinical advice to the system. So as you can see in this instance, this also may require a national patient safety alert as well as the other communication cascades. Tier 4 is the most critical of shortage and it can't be resolved at a tier 3 level, and it requires additional support from outside of the healthcare system. So an EPRR response often is invoked at this point, and it's often accompanied by a bespoke communication plan specific to the healthcare organizations that are affected, and specifically to the professionals and the clinicians who are managing these patients. So you still will have an entry onto the tool, and potentially you can have an MSN to accompany it, but the communications will be much more targeted, much more bespoke, obviously due to the risks that we're trying to mitigate. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'll hand over to Bernadette and Rachel for the next part. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you, Zahir and Kate. Very informative as ever. Good morning, everybody. This is Bernadette Sinclair Jenkins. I'm the Medical Product Supply Lead for MHRA. Could we have the next slide, please? I'd just like to take some time to discuss the definition and importance of a robust supply chain, because it really is key. So the medicine supply chain refers to the entire process of producing, distributing and delivering pharmaceutical products to patients. And that includes everything from raw material sourcing to manufacturing, packaging, storage and transportation, ultimately reaching healthcare providers and patients. A robust supply chain is crucial for several reasons. Firstly, patient safety. It ensures that patients receive safe, effective and high quality medications. Accessibility facilitates timely access to medicines, especially during public health emergencies. And of course, we're all here to work together to make sure that our patients do have timely access. So much time and effort is put in to developing medicines by the pharma sector, and producing them and distributing them and controlling them to appropriate quality standards. So it really is important that all the work that goes into developing and producing and delivering those products is merited by patient access. If the patient cannot access the medicine, then all that effort has been for nothing. So it really is key. Obviously, there are cost efficiency benefits, optimizing resources, reducing waste, very important in this era of environmental focus. And that leads to lower costs for healthcare systems and patients, also improving access. And last but not least, of course, regulatory compliance. So adherence to legal and quality standards, which minimises the risks associated with falsified or substandard products penetrating the legitimate supply chain. And also in this era of the internet, patients will, on occasion, they will take matters into their own hand. If they cannot obtain a medicine via the normal channels, then there is the opportunity for the patient to access the internet and do their own searches and try to find alternative sources. And of course, that may introduce risk if those alternative sources are not legitimate. And we do see that with some of our long-running shortages at the current time. So we always take the opportunity to utilise our comms to remind patients of the risks of purchasing medicines outside the regulated supply chain. So we do need to bear that in mind with any shortage. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So what's the role of regulators in ensuring quality and safety? Well, regulatory bodies across the world play a vital role in overseeing the medicine supply chain to ensure that all products meet established safety, quality and efficacy standards. And we do this because we have an approval process. So regulators evaluate and approve new medicines before they can be marketed, ensuring they meet safety, quality and efficacy criteria. Quality control, we enforce good practices to ensure that medicines are produced consistently, controlled to quality standards and distributed appropriately. And I haven't just focused on good manufacturing practice, although of course that is very important and relevant, But I have expanded this point to include other good practices, because we have had instances where, for instance, data integrity in bioequivalent studies has resulted in the need to evaluate product marketing authorizations and to consider whether appropriate regulatory action should be taken in those cases. And colleagues may be aware of some big cases such as Synapse fairly recently. So I did want to emphasize the importance of all the good practices, not just manufacturing practice, but more broadly. Monitoring and surveillance. Continuous monitoring of the supply chain helps identify and mitigate risks, and that includes the detection of falsified products, which is obviously a major concern for regulators. Guidance and support. We do provide guidelines for manufacturers and distributors to follow, promoting best practices throughout the supply chain. And we also have targeted information about the regulatory tools that we utilise to mitigate medicines supply disruptions. And I'll come on to that later. So could we have the next slide, please? Importance of transparency for patient supply. A transparent regulator and companies are vital for ensuring patient safety and trust in the healthcare system. We need transparency because if we're going to have informed decision making, transparency allows all partners, from healthcare providers, companies, the regulator and patients, to make informed choices about decisions required to ensure patients understand the medications in use, knowing their origins and quality. And I would emphasize it's really helpful if we have accurate data in a timely way, because that really does support our discussions, both with companies but also with our colleagues in the department and NHS England, and sometimes with patient groups as well. And that helps us have a more efficient process. It's also very helpful to understand the duration of the shortage, so not just the reason for the shortage or the supply disruption, but also the likely period of disruption. Again, that helps with planning, mitigating measures. So it really is helpful to us to have that data. Risk mitigation. By having clear visibility into the supply chain, partners can quickly identify and address potential risks, production, regulatory, quality, or other events. Next slide, please. So what is our role in mitigating shortages? This is mitigating and managing and supporting our colleagues in the department and NHS England is a top priority for the agency and has been for many years. So we support healthcare partners, DHSC Medicine Supply Team, NHS England, and also UKHSA by working with them and with industry to utilise the regulatory tools that we have at our disposal where needed, and also to expedite regulatory processes where needed. MHRA, as you've heard, is a member of the Medicine Shortage Response Group, so we're well represented. We have the manager of the Defective Medicines Report Centre, we have the manager of the Pharmaceutical Information Quality Unit, we have the manager of Unlicensed Medicines team, and myself, Medical Product Supply Lead. So we have a well represented team who attends all the MSRG meetings, and we have an opportunity to support and contribute that work. That is really important. So we, in our work with that group, we will assess the products that are going to be discussed at each meeting, and we will look and see what is the issue. Is there any way that the agency can help the department or NHS England with managing and mitigating this potential shortage? So we will look to do that, and we will check internally to see if there are, what options there are, and we will discuss that with MSRG and, if appropriate, agree an action plan. We also host the Central Alert System, CAS, and through that system, National Patient Safety Alerts are issued to the healthcare system. And some of those National Patient Safety Alerts will be for the highest level of shortages. The critical impact Tier 4 shortages will generate National Patient Safety Alerts, and they're disseminated through the CAS system. And very importantly, MHRA considers impact on supply before taking regulatory actions, and will work with partners to minimise impact on supply to patients. So the Defective Medicines Report Centre, when it is informed by a company of potential recall situation, it will review the data from the company and the proposal from the company to manage the scenario. And there may well be some discussion about how to minimise supply disruption as part of that conversation. With the agency's inspection action groups, both for good manufacturing practice, good distribution practice, and pharmacovigilance and good clinical practice, those groups, they receive serious and critical GXP non-compliances from the inspectorates. And if any regulatory action is proposed, the group will consider what is the impact on supply before it finalises its decision. Now, the Department of Health Medicine Supply Team is part of those groups. So there is the opportunity for the department to share information directly with those groups before recommendations are reached. And that is a very valuable support to our decision making. And we will have conversations with the department about whether there are any critical products that could be impacted by these decisions. And sometimes our regulatory actions are constrained by the fact that there are critical medicines potentially impacted. So we have built in an assessment of supply impact to those regulatory decision-making actions. Next slide, please. Now I'll hand over to Rachel Broccoli, Deputy Director of Population Health, for these slides. Thank you, Rachel.
Many thanks, Bernadette. Yes, so as Bernadette's introduced, I'm the Interim Deputy Director of Population Health, and my work really oversees the licensing activities of applications for established medicines. So before we get into how regulatory applications can be expedited, as Bernadette's already alluded to, I want to touch on how planning regulatory activities into product lifecycle should be used in the first instance to avoid any supply issues. So, as I've just said, some supply issues can be avoided or minimised with adequate planning of the product lifecycle. It is very important to consider changes in advance and build in time for the relevant regulatory review. So we really would like to encourage companies to consider the current approval times that we have at the agency, so that where possible, variations can be processed in line with our standard processes. Many of you will be aware that the MHRA published performance metrics on the 15th day of every month, so we will be having some that will be published this time next week on our website. Next slide, please. So this is what our table looks like. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. I'm not going to go over all the details of this table because much of it is actually out of scope for this particular webinar, but I do want to focus on the highlighted areas there. So if you look at the boxes in blue there, the type 1A variations and the type 1B variations, you'll see that we are currently running on time with those. So you can expect your regulatory decision within the statutory timeline for those types of variations. So the boxes in pink, the type 2 variations, and for initial marketing authorisation applications for established medicines, we are running with backlogs. As many as you will probably know from previous webinars or from keeping up with our performance, that significant work has been done in these areas and continues to be done. And so we are looking at both these areas and improving our performance. But until then, we would like people to pay attention to these metrics such that they can plan into their regulatory activity. You will see that the numbers here may fluctuate month on month due to our clearance strategies, but it provides a starting point as an idea of how long it may take for somebody to be able to get their application reviewed. If, for instance, we don't want a pending application with us where there is a delay on our part to cause a supply issue, and therefore we have channels where you can expedite your applications such that we can review these and make sure that there is no supply disruption. And I will pass back to Bernadette actually, because she's now going to cover these processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I talked earlier about our regulatory toolkit, and I thought it would be helpful to just clarify what tools we have available to us as a regulator. So we can expedite assessments utilising our resource. So we can expedite assessments for new applications for marketing authorisations, although that is very much less commonly used. Variations and batch-specific variations, this is much more commonly used tool, as is the labelling exemptions and the use of the Dear Health professional communication mechanisms. Again, that's one of the most commonly used tool. Supply of unlicensed medicines, also quite widely used. And we can, of course, expedite variations to manufacturers and wholesale dealers' licenses. And if needed, we can expedite GXP site inspections, although of course if this involves an overseas site that might be more complex. So the agency is able to access expertise right across the system, through from the data entry teams through to the HQA assessors, the GXP teams, process licensing teams, and safety and surveillance. So we can reach out to colleagues in all these areas to ask for their support in mitigating a medicine shortage. So another tool that's available is the movement of medicines around the healthcare system without the need for a wholesale dealer's license. And there was some guidance introduced when we moved from the Medicines Act into the new human medicines regulations in 2012, as they were at the time. So there was a disapplication of an old provision in the Act, and there was the need to introduce some flexibility about movement, particularly between one pharmacy to another or one hospital to another, where there was a case of patient need and there was a lack of stock available in the system to meet all needs. So there is guidance available on that. And of course, we do provide advice and guidance on specific case-by-case examples, and I'll come on to some in a moment. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So I thought it'd be helpful to just draw attention to where you can access the guidance and advice on these regulatory tools. And there is actually a wealth of information available on gov.uk to help in understanding what the processes are and to guide you through the various processes. So the first one I've highlighted is the medicine shortages regulatory process to manage supply disruptions. and that's very comprehensive, and also that links with the second source of information advice, which is it was an HRT, hormone replacement therapy workshop that we ran, but there is again a wealth of detailed information on the website to support companies. So it's not just relevant to companies who market HRT medicines. The reason that we produced the workshop was that there was an HRT supply challenge as a result of an increase in demand that hadn't been forecast. And this led to the department establishing a specific task force on HRT medicines. We were part of that task force, and we also set up our own incident management team within MHRA, calling on our resources from across the agency to support companies in expediting regulatory processes to increase the supply of HRT medicines for our patients. As part of that work, we did the workshops, and we wanted to make that information and advice generally available, hence it was hosted on gov.uk. So there is a wealth of very detailed support on that. And then if your regulatory tool is going to be a batch specific variation, there is also a specific piece of guidance on BSVs, and that's when the unexpected happens, batch specific variations, and that's probably one of our most commonly used tools. So I do encourage colleagues to, if they think they might need to request an expedited process and they know which process it's likely to be, to familiarise themselves with the requirements prior to submission. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So within MHRA, we do have an escalation process for assessing requests for expedited assessments, and any request to expedite should be accompanied with a statement from either the department or NHS England as appropriate that there is a public health need for the medicine. There should be compelling evidence of benefit in a public health emergency, or if there is a shortage of supply of an essential medicine. We will review the requests, and when we do that, we'll take a number of factors into account, but this is not an exhaustive list. It's very much case specific. So we will look at what is the patient impact, is there a particular vulnerable population, for instance, paediatric patients. We will also look at, well, if there is a disruption in supply of one of the marketed products in that class, how long is that period of disruption going to be? So we'll factor that into our assessment. What other regulatory submissions are already in progress within the agency? So we will check on that, and at what stage are they? And we will also look at what is the impact of expediting this on our other work. So once we have done all that and reached a conclusion, we'll finalise the outcome and advise the department or NHS England accordingly. We do have to be aware that everything that we prioritise and expedite means that something else is deprioritised. So there is an opportunity cost to this work, and we have to be conscious of that. Next slide, please. So how can you help us help you? Could we move on to the next one? So how can you work with us to help us be more efficient, which helps you be more efficient? So to help MHRA being efficient in expediting regulatory processes, we do ask that companies provide the department or NHS England statement about the public health need with the regulatory submission. So we need those two things together. we ask that you state the product name, the strength, the presentation, and the product license number. Include urgent in the email subject line. Please state the submission ID number in the submission request. There are a number of cases where I have been asked to consider an expedited request and or to find out where it is in the system. And if I don't have the submission ID number, it just creates a lot of additional work, and it results in delay. So it really is important to state the submission ID number. And please state what is the reason for the regulatory process. If it's a variation, select the appropriate type, and please provide all relevant data in the submission. This will reduce the likelihood of requests for further information, and again, it makes the process more efficient. And if we're trying to do some work to mitigate a shortage or prevent a shortage, time is of the essence, of course. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So what else can industry do to help prevent or mitigate shortages? We've got suggestions here. Please know your medicines, know your patient population, know the clinical use, and that would include, if you do know of off-label uses, some products do have niche off-label uses. So it's really helpful if you are aware of that. Do know your contractors and their current GXP and other compliance status. So again, not just your manufacturers, but also your raw material suppliers. If you contract out analytical services, what's the status of your testing laboratory? I do have had in the past involvement with suspension action against a contract laboratory which was named as a testing laboratory on a very large number of marketing authorizations. So these can add complexity. It's very important to know the status of all your contractors and to monitor it, keep up to date. And another thing that I would suggest is that you don't just want to know when your contractors have regulatory action pending against them, but it's helpful if you know when they have regulatory inspections and what the outcome of those inspections are. Sometimes we stop short of formal regulatory action, but there may still be action and it may still be relevant because it may result in, for instance, a reduction in capacity of the manufacturing site or the quality control testing lab. And other compliance status, just to emphasise that, of course, we're not the only regulator. It might seem like that, but of course we are not. And there have been occasions with supply disruptions where it has actually been as a result of another regulator's actions. So I do recall a case from some time ago where the health and safety executive had put in place an enforcement notice against a contract manufacturer because they had allowed a significant amount of waste to build up on the site, and that waste had an explosion risk. And so as a result of the enforcement action by HSE, production had to stop, and of course that had an ongoing impact then on supply of the medicine. And of course, if the product is a controlled drug, then Home Office will also have an oversight of the controlled drug licensing regime. So companies who are working in the arena with controlled drugs, I'm sure are aware that Home Office have their own licensing requirements and they have their own timelines and constraints on that system. So it's sensible to be aware of other regulators and compliance status of your contractors. Know your supply chain and its vulnerabilities. keep dossiers up to date, and we do sometimes get issues with, for instance, labels and leaflets not being kept up to date, which can result in some challenges for supply. Optimize processes, so aim for early detection and communication. It's really helpful for the department and NHS England and ourselves to have early notification of pending issues. Monitor wider geopolitical issues and environmental issues. I think that's fairly obvious. I know of sites where disruptions occurred because of unexpected weather events, floods, hurricanes and tornadoes, particularly impacting on certain key US sites. Obviously, the geopolitical issues with activity in the Ukraine and also in the East. So these issues have to be monitored closely because they can impact on the distribution and logistics of products. You know, new travel routes might need to be organised at short notice, and that can have an impact on supply. So it's sensible to be aware of how these wider geopolitical issues may impact on your particular supply chain, and only you will know that. And do have contingency plans in place for supply disruptions. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to end by reminding marketing authorization holders, manufacturers and wholesalers that you do have legal duties with respect to supply of medicines. So each responsible party in the supply chain does have their own obligations. That's set out in the Human Medicines Regulations. We did issue some guidance a long time ago now because of a particular challenge that we were experiencing in that time. That challenge doesn't exist anymore, but the guidance about the obligations is still relevant. So I just wanted to end by reminding the sector that you have legal responsibilities to maintain within the limits of your responsibilities supplies for UK patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. So with that, I would just like to thank everybody for your attendance. I hope you found it useful in terms of looking at the system, how we all work together from NHS and a department and MHRA perspective. Obviously, we do link with the devolved nations with managing any supply issues and supply disruptions as well. If there are any other questions or feedback, we would be very great to receive them, and really looking to make sure that we make this process as effective as possible, so that transparency from both us and making sure that we are looking and answering the questions that we have through escalation, through whatever we're looking to do that, but equally the earliest possible warning that we are facing a supply disruption. As part of looking at ongoing mitigations, one of the questions that came up in my mind while we were talking was around ensuring that licenses are kept up to date, and sometimes there are commercial reasons why they are not. And that's something that we are looking at to ensure that we have that view that how many applicants are in the market, how can we look at that to make sure that if there are supply disruptions, how can we facilitate that? So there are other activities that are ongoing, and I would encourage that if there are other ideas that people would wish to raise to us, then please do so. But finally, just to say thank you to presenters from today, and also to you all for attending. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email in the coming weeks with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of the MHRA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day.